Good morning and welcome to everyone who just joined us at the CPAC conference. Hope your day is going well so far. There have been some fantastic presentations that we have heard this morning, and I look forward to this panel. So I'm just going to provide a brief introduction to every panelist, and then we'll go by the order on the itinerary. And then each presenter will have 15 minutes, and afterwards we'll have a Q&A. So we'll begin with Thomas Mcgee, who is a PhD candidate at the Peter McMullen Center on Statelessness. His research project focuses on Syria's changing statelessness landscape since the start of the country's civil war in 2011. He also has worked with a center in Lebanon on a project about nomadic peoples and statelessness. He is an associate member of the European Network on Statelessness, and prior to joining the center, worked on their joint Stateless Journeys project with the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. His academic work on statelessness has appeared in the Tilburg Law Review, Statelessness Working Papers series, and the Oxford Monitor of Forced Migration. At the same time, he has contributed to a number of country of origin information reports on Syria and served as a country expert for immigration appeal cases relating to stateless Kurds from Syria. On this panel is also Jacob Eriksson, who is a fellow at CPAD. He is the Al-Tajir Lecturer in Post-War Recovery Studies in the Department of Politics at the University of York. His research interests include conflict resolution, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Middle Eastern politics and security, post-war recovery, and peace building. His first book, Small State Mediation in International Conflicts, Diplomacy and Negotiation in Israel-Palestine, was published by IB Tauris in 2015. And he's the editor, together with Dr. Ahmed Khalil, of Iraq After ISIS, The Challenges of Post-War Recovery, published by Palgrave in 2019. His current research project, funded by the CNJB Morale Trust, is on Iraq's post-ISIS recovery, focusing in particular on issues of governance, security sector reform, transitional justice, and reconciliation. Mansour Anbarmou is a PhD candidate in political science at Islamic Azad University, Science and Research Branch in Tehran, Iran. He obtained his master's degree in political science from Mufid University in Qom in Iran in 2014. His research interests include Iranian religious currents and Shia and Sunni minorities divide and interaction in Iran. His recent publications are The Preface on Nature and Dimension of Ayatollah Khomeini's Thoughts, The Epistemology of Salafism in Iran, Case Study, The Approach of the Sunni Religious Currents, the Today Party's Stance on Iran's Islamic Revolution, and the Impact of Iranian Fantasy on Marxism. And last but not least, Al-Mahdi Al-Ahmed holds a master's degree in sociology and anthropology from the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar, and a master's degree in politics, citizenship, and religion from the University of Padova in Italy. He holds a Bachelor of Education, Philosophy, and Teaching Methods from École Normale Supérieure à Maroc, and a Bachelor's in Sociology from Ibn Zuhri University, also from Morocco, respectively. Al-Mahdi served as a research assistant at Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies and a research analyst at Radius Consultancy. He is currently a research assistant at Ibn Khaldun Center for Humanities and Social Studies at Qatar University, and the editorial secretary of Tajsir, a peer-reviewed journal published by Qatar University Press. Along with his colleagues at Ibn Khaldun Center at Qatar University, he organized and co-organized several national and international symposia, roundtables, and conferences on various social sciences issues in the Arab world. He participated in research projects including FIFA World Cup 2022 and its impact on the local community. His research publications include a co-authored article on social determinants in shaping the country image, the case of 2022 World Cup in State of Qatar, and a translated book chapter towards indigenization of an uncertain transplant, 100 Years of Sociology in India. So let's begin with Thomas. You have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, Ruba. So I'll start by saying that I'm really pleased to be able to participate in this conference. Thank you so much to all the organizers. And now I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Can you see that? Okay, great. So as you can see, the title of my presentation today is Lived Citizenship in Crisis, Changing Constructions of Identity for Stateless Kurds from Syria. And I really wanted to focus on the lived aspect of both citizenship and statelessness, as often being in the law school myself, I feel like these concepts are very much hollowed out to purely legal conceptions, and it's very easy to lose sight of the meaning of statelessness and citizenship for the individuals who experience them. So the intention here is to interrogate the assumption that getting citizenship is necessarily the full and final solution to statelessness, as is often the implication in UN discourse on the issue, whereby naturalization is seen as an uncomplicated success story. So I would like to begin by recalling the words of this stateless Kurd from Syria in the image, as he spoke back in 2010. He told me, "Tell my story to the people of your country, and when you tell it, I want you to use my real name." Fully conscious of the danger this might entail, he continued, "You might not be able to give me an identity card, but you can give me a name that I can be proud of." So this was while I was working for a human rights project documenting the situation of stateless Kurds in Syria. Hesitant to fulfill his request at the time for fear of the persecution that he might face for speaking out on the issue, I could only hope that reproducing the expression of his request might some way serve the motivations behind it. Now, however, a decade on, it's possible to reveal that this is Mcgee, who has since acquired Syrian nationality, thereafter emigrated to Germany, where he has now become a German citizen also. But the situation remains complicated, since decades of deprivation cannot be simply erased overnight. So telling his story and that of other stateless Kurds from Syria is exactly what I hope to try and do in the 15 minutes I have now, to the extent possible. So I thought it would be useful to begin with just the very basics of the history of statelessness in Syria. So essentially, the problem began in 1962, when the government at the time carried out an exceptional census. This took place only in the northeastern governorate of the country, Hasaka, which is where the majority of the Kurdish population reside. It was carried out on a pretty discriminatory basis, and overnight it stripped some 120,000 Kurds of their citizenship. It's been well documented that it was carried out in an arbitrary way. It was conducted in a single day, and there was no possibility of follow-up or rectification for people who'd missed out. It was also only announced in the National Gazette, the Jarida Rasmiya, which met due to communications at the time and the fact that not everybody would have heard of it. Many people simply missed out because they were not present on the day. Over time, this status was inherited by children. So the number had reached 300,000 over up until 2011. The other key date is April 2011, when the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad issued a naturalization decree. This targeted the Ajanib of Hasaka, who are the foreigners of Hasaka the largest proportion of the stateless Kurds. And it granted them citizenship, but was largely seen as a conciliatory reform measure in the context of the Syrian uprising, and considered a move to try and deter Kurds from participating in the uprising. So looking now at the pre-2011 context, how was statelessness lived by Kurds of Syria? So essentially, it was very much framed as a human rights issue for all Kurds of Syria. So not all Kurds in Syria were stateless, but it was seen as a mobilizing issue and a unifying issue. There were many other divisive issues across the Kurdish political parties in terms of ideological agenda, in terms of what form of self-determination might be appropriate, but this was a unifying issue that all Kurdish parties could get behind. We see in the image here, this was a protest march that took place in 2003, where largely women and children marched towards the UNICEF office in Damascus. You can see the slogan says in Arabic, "Towards a happy childhood free from discrimination and oppression." And the red signs that you can see some of the women carrying represent the bitakat hamra, the red cards that the ajanib would hold, which were the only form of civil identification they had. So this is an example of how the Kurdish movement and community at large tried to make this issue visible, and it was very much symbolic in the universalist language of human rights and rights of the child. It was a form of internationalizing the Kurdish predicament and right struggle. So very much the issue of statelessness was central and integral to Kurdish identity, as it featured in Kurdish literature. There were often annual ceremonies, commemorations of the 1962 census, where plays reenacted the issue and presented the census committee. So that all changed with the Syrian revolution, the Syrian uprising in 2011. So in general, I don't have time to go into it much, but here I just wanted to touch on the fact that citizenship within the context of the uprising became a very powerful symbolic vehicle for political messaging in different directions. So here we have just two examples. You can see on the right, there's a reimagining of the ideal form of citizenship according to the Syrian opposition. So here we can see a Syrian ID card has been recreated with imagined details. So the first name has become Syria, the surname is for all sects and religion, etc. And then on the other side, we see how citizenship can also be used as a means of attack through satire. So this is, again, a photoshopped ID card, but this time in the name of the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, but with the details, the personal details replaced by offensive language, essentially. So while this was happening, the situation was equally changing significantly for the Kurds of Syria, who's a large section of whom since 1962 had been deprived of citizenship, which meant that they struggled to access basic rights, be it healthcare, education. They couldn't register property, marriage, housing in their name. But as mentioned in 2011, a presidential decree was released that granted citizenship to the majority of the stateless Kurds. This was largely, while stateless Kurds welcomed the offer of citizenship for practical reasons, access to these rights that had been deprived previously, in general, the Kurdish streets rejected the context and the discourse that accompanied the offer of citizenship. So here we can see, this is from the the youth of Kamishli. كنا ضد الفساد, we're all against corruption. لا نريد الجنسية, we don't want citizenship. بل نريد الحرية, but we don't want citizenship, but we want freedom. So it was a rejection of what was perceived to be having to take a political compromise for the opportunity of taking on citizenship, whereby many Kurdish individuals saw that this was being offered as a political concession, largely to discourage Kurds from participating in the revolution, in the demonstrations. As such, it was more of a seen as a tactic to silence Kurds. So one of my interviewees said, for decades we had been silenced through statelessness. Now we were being silenced through citizenship. There were also multiple issues around the wording of the decree, that it merely granted citizenship to the Ajanib Kurds rather than returning or restoring. So many Kurds of Syria also wanted some recognition that it was ultimately a right that they had that they'd been deprived of, rather than being given its citizenship as a token. So there was also the issue of the legacy of statelessness and suffering, and in many ways being naturalized. While it offered all kinds of practical benefits, it also in many ways was seen as closing down the discussion and the issue, and people felt that they were deprived of the narrative. There was no avenue to discuss the decades of citizenship, because it felt like the way it was presented with the presidential decree, it felt like problem solved, it's time to move on. And particularly with everything happening at the same time with the uprising, there was little opportunity to discuss these issues and to have a debate about kind of transitional justice issues around this point. Essentially, many Kurds felt that the way that the citizenship was presented to them didn't respond to any of the calls for naturalization over the decades. So it wasn't a response to their activism as a community, to the mobilization. Many people were very annoyed that after years of requesting the citizenship and being told it was too complicated, too complex an issue to deal with, and needed to be studied carefully, and this was always the reason why it was postponed almost indefinitely until 2011. Then suddenly, when the political context made it beneficial to the regime, it was possible to issue the decree with a flick of a pen. I mean, the decree that finally came out was just 3 articles long, and 2 of them were completely perfunctory, saying it's going to be published in the official gazette. The other one says it's valid from now. So there was only 1 article that had any content that just said Ajanib Kurds are granted the citizenship. So really, this is an ongoing debate, and it's one that a number of formerly stateless Kurds themselves have engaged in around questions of the legacy of statelessness and their ongoing citizenship. There's been a recent publication called Citizenship Disappeared by a Syrian NGO, which I think is quite interesting. And that's something that I'm looking at in my wider research. I can stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I forgot to introduce myself, actually. I introduced everyone. I was going to do that during Q&A, but my name is Ruba Al-Hassani, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Lancaster University and Project CPAD. And I'm very happy with this panel, and Jacob is next.
All right, wonderful. Thanks so much, Ruba. Thanks for the opportunity to present some of my ongoing work. So this paper links to a book project that I'm currently working on that I know is close to your heart, Ruba, in terms of thinking about Iraq and contemporary politics in Iraq. But so I'm looking at the issues of state building, nation building, and peace building in the context of what I kind of refer to as Iraq's post-ISIS recovery, which is of course erroneous because ISIS is still there, but I'm still looking for a better kind of terminological way of describing that situation. But so what I think we see is that when we had the territorial defeat of ISIS in 2017, there was a kind of landmark moment where I think we had, and Iraqis had the potential to alter prior notions of belonging and to think differently about processes of inclusion and exclusion in Iraq. In my paper today, I'd like to look at how three different processes of what we broadly refer to as post-war recovery, so state building, nation building, and peace building, can inform different policy approaches towards things like transitional justice and reconciliation, traditionally conceived of as important pillars of post-war recovery, and how these different policy approaches can affect the sense of belonging within the state and the nation, and how they can cultivate legitimacy. So I'll start by a very brief kind of terminological overview then. Apologies for not having any slides, but I'm going old school today. If we start with the concept of state building, Nicolas Lemay-Hebert, for example, in his work on state building, distinguishes between an institutionalist conception of the state, which links to Max Weber's, kind of descriptions and conceptions of the state, and a more social conception of the state represented by the work of someone like Emil Durkheim. And so if we think of the former conception of the state, the Weberian conception, we tend to focus on the administrative capability of the state, the ability of the state apparatus to affirm its authority. For example, by providing things like security and classically ensuring a monopoly on the use of force. The latter conception of the state, the Durkheimian conception, thinks of the state more as an organ of social thought, an entity that comprises the sentiments, ideals, beliefs that the society has worked out collectively and over time. So we have two different conceptions of the state here. And in terms of our international definitions of state building, we've seen a gradual change from the more institutionally focused definitions and emphasis to one that thinks more about state-society relations. So if we look at definitions from kind of prominent international actors or organizations, we can think about the OECD definition, which emphasizes state building as, quote, an endogenous process to enhance capacity, institutions, and legitimacy of the state, driven by state-society relations. So here is a definition that encompasses both the institutional side and the social side. And similarly, if we look to a definition of state building provided by the, of course, now deceased, but formerly known as the British Department for International Development, DFID, talks about state building as being concerned with state capacity, institutions, and legitimacy, much like the OECD definition, but also talks about processes that underpin state-society relations. So here again, there is an emphasis on the fact that the effectiveness of the state and the quality of its linkages to society is what determines a country's prospects for peace and development, using their own terminology there. So if that's state building, we also have the terminology of nation building. Now, this is a term that, at least to my mind, is often used incorrectly, primarily by American scholars, who, when they use the term nation building, are actually talking about institutionally focused state building. Whereas I think nation building, certainly in my conception, and perhaps in a more European conception, is thought of very differently. So Anthony Giddens, for example, talks about a nation as a political project that has worked, as a successful mobilization of things like homeland myths and identity, not just an ethnic identity, by a particular political entity. Although I think it's important to stress that this doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of a nation state. We can think of a broader unification of people if we conceive of nation building through the terms, for example, of Benedict Anderson and his famous notion of imagined communities, or indeed if we think of French sociologist Maurice Holbrook's notion of a mnemonic community that shares a collective memory, and that it's that collective memory that is part of the constituency of the nation. So we have nation as a communal identity that can comprise lots of different ethnicities, languages, religions, sects, etc., lots of different identifiers. But as state building and peace building scholar Dominic Balthazar argues, nation building is also at some point eventually about the standardization of certain social and cognitive patterns. So there is a process of standardization here in terms of belonging to the nation and what the parameters are of this belonging to a nation. And if we think of state building as a process that indeed should be largely endogenous with a limited exogenous role, then I think nation building is even more so, something that needs to be internally determined. If we think about the relationship between state building and nation building, Lemay Hebert, for example, argues that we can't actually really distinguish between these two processes, as state institutions on the one hand and society that is governed by them are mutually constitutive. So basically the point being that the creation of institutions has concrete repercussions on the nature of the society and socio-political cohesion. We also see Dominic Balthazar talking about the fact that, quote, state building cannot succeed without nation building, as states need to develop and maintain a shared identity framework. So it's clear that there's a relationship here between nation building and state building. We add our third kind of concept in here, peace building. Peace building, according to UN definition, is basically all about reducing the risk of lapsing or relapsing into conflict. And the way that this is to be done is by strengthening national capacities for conflict management and laying the foundations for sustainable peace. And then there's a longer, kind of elaboration, which mentions the necessary conditions for positive and sustainable peace, addressing deep-rooted structural causes of violence, and so on and so forth. So here we have a process and a concept of peace building that theoretically and perhaps ideally, state building and nation building should both contribute towards. But it's important to stress that this isn't necessarily the case. And the compatibility of all of these three different processes can potentially depend on what type of peace is actually being built. So within the peace kind of building scholarship, we have the kind of classic distinction by Johan Galtung of negative and positive peace, where negative peace is the absence of violence, whereas positive peace is the integration of human society. And so it depends what level of certainly this kind of spectrum peace is actually being created at. it's worth noting that the UN definition of peace building talks about strengthening national capacities for conflict management. What are these national capacities? These are often conceived of in terms of state institutions. And so we can think of a state that has strong institutions and capacities, for example, say policing or a monopoly on violence. But that's not to say that this power is necessarily going to be used for a productive purpose or indeed a peaceful purpose. This power can be used for repression. So is it the kind of social focus of nation building that is important to overcoming potential frictions between these concepts? Perhaps it is the case that inclusive nation building that really has equality at its core can help contribute to, kind of this kind of positive relationship between the three concepts. But what we do see is that nation building can often be exclusive. It can often be based on inequality. Balthasar also talks about the potential friction between something like peace building and state building, when he notes that peace building is broadly about creating a situation of non-violence and coexistence, despite the fact that there are differences. And by virtue of doing this is basically geared at trying to institutionalize identity pluralism and the acceptance of other communities, while state making is critically aimed at forging a common shared identity and standardizing rules, which isn't necessarily based on identity multiplicity. So Balthasar is kind of interestingly looking at the potential friction here between state building and peace building as well. So if those are our kind of broad conceptual sketches of how these different concepts do or don't, can or cannot relate to each other, I'll move on now to thinking about how this can be applied to the contemporary case of Iraq. And if we look at Iraq, we can look at the evidence for what Lemay Hebert was talking about, this mutually constitutive relationship between state building and nation building, as being particularly evident in the kind of post-Saddam era. So if we look, for example, at the institutions that were built by the Coalition Provisional Authority, these were institutions that were largely seen by the Sunni community as being institutions that represented a consolidation of Shia state domination and Shia power. And we can see that the policies that were pursued during this time basically failed to contribute towards inclusive nation building or indeed, kind of inclusive peace building. Rather, what we see as, kind of our colleague Fanar Haddad has talked about within the Iraqi context in his work on sectarianism, what we've seen was really the growth of kind of parallel and competing Sunni and Shia nationalisms within Iraq and how they related to the state. And that's not even to mention, kind of the Kurdish conception of nationalism, which is obviously also a component of the state. So very, very quickly, I want to look at how these different guiding principles of state building, nation building, and peace building can generate different approaches to post-war recovery, looking in particular at issues to do with transitional justice and reconciliation. So within transitional justice, we have this notion of retributive justice that has to do with judicial prosecutions and trials for crimes committed during the course of a conflict. Now, this approach to transitional justice, in a sense, focuses very much on state building, in that it makes sense, it looks to emphasize that the state is the legal arbiter who is responsible for the rule of law. And so, when a crime, for example, has been committed against an individual, it is seen as having been committed against the state by virtue of that individual being a citizen. So it's the state taking responsibility for prosecuting crimes that have been committed. And so a very retributively focused process can emphasize the state above all else. And in the Iraqi context, what we've seen is that we have in the aftermath of the territorial defeat of ISIS, we have a retributive justice process that's been emphasized by the state that has once again basically been tantamount to the collective punishment of the Iraqi Sunni community. It's notable that only ISIS crimes are actually being prosecuted, and they're being tried under a very broad counterterrorism law rather than focusing on individual crimes being committed. We have significant failures of due process, failures of evidentiary standards, together with the arbitrary detention of individuals by both state security forces and the Hashid militia. So the role of the state has, actually, I think, been very problematic in terms of this aspect of transitional justice. What we've seen is that international support for reconciliation, a more socially focused process of coming together. For example, if we look at something like the UNDP's local peace committees, also seem to be taking a state building approach in that they seem to be geared towards creating a forum for communication between citizens and local government. Critics of these local peace committees observe that the participants don't always understand their role within the bodies, they don't understand the purpose of the bodies, and they don't understand what exactly happens to the contents of their discussion, or indeed who's going to be implementing any of the findings that the kind of peace commission comes to. So here we have a state building approach that actually can have the counterintuitive effect of weakening citizens' identification with the state when it doesn't actually deliver what it's supposed to. If we think about a different approach to justice, like restorative justice, which tends to focus on, kind of a much more social process of coming together, for example, in truth commissions. Restorative justice, and I know this is close to your heart, Ruba, can potentially offer, I think, the chance to perform nation building and peace building by actually engaging all segments of diverse local communities in dialogue. That you have a public and a discursive system of restorative justice as the potential beginning of trying to establish a shared historical understanding of what's actually happened in the course of a conflict, or at least the beginning of a way to understand that there are multiple and different conflict narratives and to kind of socially acknowledge the variety of different narratives. However, we can also make the argument that this process might heighten intercommunal differences by focusing on crimes committed, and that this might be detrimental to something like nation building. And it comes back to Balthasar's point here about the relationship between pluralism and standardization that we see in the kind of nation and the state. The final point that I'll make, because I appreciate I'm running out of time here, is that we do have alternative approaches to reconciliation and justice that has been represented by and sponsored by international organizations like the US Institute of Peace, that has been working directly with local NGOs and local actors to, for example, negotiate tribal reconciliation pacts to ensure the return of displaced peoples, such as, for example, the Sunni families of people deemed or suspected to be affiliated with ISIS, whose return communities have rejected their return. What's interesting, though, is that in these processes of local negotiation and reconciliation, there's been very little state role in this process. And the state has actually been actively closing displacement camps for individuals such as this, without considering the needs of, kind of their future rights, and without ensuring that they have documentation that all citizens should have, for example. So the continued marginalization of these citizens by either denying them return or indeed closing down camps and ensuring that they are continually displaced is very dangerous. And it's not contributing to either nation building or indeed to peace building. And that this has a very negative impact on the wider Sunni community in terms of their understanding of their place within the state and in society. So in conclusion, I think that there is, I think a really interesting capacity for restorative justice to simultaneously contribute to state building, peace building, and nation building. But that depends on having widespread consultation with communities on the nature of the process, a commitment to inclusivity of that process from the state, and a very clear state role in terms of organizing and leading that process. I think this is unlikely to happen in the Iraqi case, and I'd be more than happy to talk about why that might be the case within the Q&A, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you so much. You're on mute there, Riba.
Okay, that's such a pandemic thing to say. I said thank you, Jacob, for your presentation. Mansour, you're up next.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the floor. I would like to thank the organizer of this great event, and I think we have a good turnout, so that's great, and a pleasure to be part of this great conference. By the way, thank you for having me. I would like to demonstrate a succinct presentation, so I will try to recap my debate about 10 minutes or less. So let me share some data to have a deep understanding about what is happening in Iran and Iranian Sunnis. As you see, we have a kind of weird transformation of Arab uprising concept. As Ayatollah Khomeini said, we interpret Arab uprising into Islamic awakening, and it was understood as a natural continuation of Iranian revolution. Also, they interpret democracy as an Islamic uprising and a result of the victory of a big revolution of Iranian nation. My argument is, and I find cogent to say, that Iranian Sunnis are in the midst of nationalism and transnational ethnic religious affiliation. As you know, the issue of Sunnis citizenship in the multi-ethnic and multi-religious society of Iran is one of the most important fields of study, and it's related to nationalism and ethnic religious affiliation. The Sunnis of Iran consists of a sect of ethnicities with a population of 10 million people who have ethnic and religious division with the Shia community and the government. In this picture, as you see, the Iranian Sunnis numbers are here, and I would like to mention that the Sunnis are about the 50% of the population of Iran. In this field, as you see, here I want to emphasize at the diaspora of Iranian Sunnis, they are Kurds, Turkmens, Baluch, Arabs, and Taleshians. As you know, the most sects of Iranian Sunnis are Hanafi, Shafi'i, Sufism, and Hanbali. And I would like to say that, as you know, Iran has changed several religions since the beginning of the history. And until the 15th century, Iran was a Sunni majority state. As you know, in the 10th century, after the formalization of the Shia religion by Safavis, Iran became Shia states. And Sunnis in Iran migrated in a centrifugal process and gradually to borders and beyond. As you see, there are the location of the Sunnis in Iran, they are around the borders and beyond them. My argument is, since the beginning of the Arab Spring, Iranian Shia have experienced three movements. As you know, in 2009, as Green Movement, 2017, and 2015. Although, since this uprising did not lead to the serious Sunni confrontation with Shia political rule, also they did raise awareness of the need for active political mobilization and their participation in building up the government. Thus, as you see, Iran is located around the countries who have Sunni and Shia population. And the most significant of them are Pakistan, Turkey, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and United Arab Emirates. But what is happening in Iran and what is the interaction of Iranian Sunnis with the government? I consider that as a kind of nationalism. As you know, after the 1979 revolution, the political sovereignty in Iran made great effort to depoliticize the Sunnis in order to not to make demands and to limit their sphere of activity in the political construction. Religious communities, Islam, long social life, and sectarian cohesion are among the most important Sunni nationalist affiliation. As you know, in Islamic Revolution in 1979 and Iran-Iraq War in 1980, there is almost 40,000 killed of Sunni people. As you see in this picture, there are the Sunni people of Kurdistan. Kurdistan is a city in the west of Iran. There are people who go to the battlefields with Iraq. But if I want to talk about the blinding, I would like to share the hybrid identity of Iranian Sunnis. As you know, hybridity is a concept to show how people are developed in the society and with the government. Let me show. As you know, Sunnis by far is the largest branch of Islam and also in Iran. The long life and historical, cultural, and social affiliation of the Shia Sunni societies have created the hybrid identity in Iran. The most important foundation of this hybrid identity or hybridity is language, religion, ethnicity, and long history of living together for several generations. And the hybrid identity is more reflected in the third and fourth generation of Iranian Sunnis who was born in Iran. Their appearance and the language have become like Iranians, pursuing their political and social and professional futures in Iran. If I want to talk about the transnational affiliation, I would like to share this picture with you. As you know, here is the Mcgee Mosque, the largest Sunni mosque in Iran, is located in Zahedan, Sistan, Balochistan province. And they have educational belonging with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. And this picture, I share some data about the Balochistan area. As you know, there are transnational affiliation in the field of ethnicity. The Baloch of Iran and Baloch of Pakistan are unique. As the Islamic Republic of Iran seek to influence the Shia of neighboring countries and organize them around its axis, emphasizing the concept of nationalism or ummatism, major concern exists about the effect of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia on the Iranian Sunni majority. In this period, I would like to share some data about the civic culture of Iranian Sunnis. They are, at the beginning of the revolution in 1979, take a parochial stance about the election, but after 40 years, nowadays, they are participant civic culture and try to make some difference about the government, about the politics in Iran. As you know, there are some canals to some religious political currents in Iran have more reflected their idea. I want to share some data about the Iranian Color Reform Organization. They are a branch of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin movement in Iran, also in Egypt and Turkey and Qatar. As you know, they have a practical plan of government. They have political participation in politics and society, and they are enlightened. Also, they're influenced by the Egyptian Ikhwan, and they have a modern interpretation on government, women, and so on. In this picture, I would like to share some pics about the influence of the Iranian Color Reform Organization in Iran. As you see, they are located in south of Iran and at the northeast. The second current, second religious political currents of Sunnis in Iran is Tabligh Jamaat. They also have transnational belonging with Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan. I would like to say that they have jurisprudential approach. They are traditional. They are more conservative about women and social freedom. And this picture, you have seen Ayatollah Khamenei, leaders of Iran, and Maulavi Abdul Hamid Ismail Sehi. They meet together last year. But what about the other current? It's about the Sufism. Sufism consists of Naqshbandi and Qadiriya movement in Iran, who are the transnational belonging with Iraq, Turkey, and India. I must say that they are non-political. They have more interaction with political rule, and so Iranian society also, they have chosen a political criticism, and they gradually want to participate in the government. In this picture, you can see the face of leaders, current leader of them. But in Iran, we have kind of depoliticization of Sunnis by government. As you know, they are legally not allowed to be elected as a leader and as a president. They have faced restriction on political participation. They are confronting the formation of Sunni political and religious rulership. They have economic deprivation and deliberate undevelopment, and also government try to reduce the weight of Sunni vote in the election. And the final point I have is the manifestation of the Iranian Sunnis political identity in the last 10 years. They trying to enter city councils and municipalities. They increase number of representatives in Iranian parliament from 12 to 25. They try to formation of political and ethnic factions in parliament. They wanted to change item of constitution at the Islamic Republic regarding of leadership and presidency of Sunnis. They're demanding to entry of Sunnis into high political position. Also, they take international political movements such as Abdul Hamid letter to Ayatollah Sistani. In this research, he wrote about the discrimination against Iranian Sunnis. They want to participate in international conference, namely, and especially in Mecca and Istanbul, Turkey, and also their increasing political stance, namely congratulation of Taliban on formation of Islamic Emirates. Thanks for taking your time. I'm here to answer the question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mansour. Al-Mahdi, you're next.
Thank you so much, Roba. And thank you for having me. It's like a pleasure to be here and to be part of this network. I mean, there is a lot of things to understand, to elaborate on this network. So without further ado, let me just share my presentation if possible. So as you perhaps can see, the title I choose for this, it's a sort of paper I intended actually to submit for a journal, but I thought this is going to be a good opportunity also to present in front of you and to discuss. This is more into like a presentation more than a discussion more than a presentation. So just like the case with any other academic, I try to choose that kind of attractive like title, as you can see, and by the way, so perhaps I forgot that the event can be unfolding very rapidly, very quickly, that many of the points that I can include can be quickly left behind. So actually, large part of my actual research was based on fact and data just after the blockade of 2017 against Qatar. But for the moment being, it was only perhaps a day or two when we have seen in the Gulf leaders, like at the GCC summit in Riyadh, calling for solidarity, calling for unity, and all these kind of things. this is perhaps, maybe I shall perhaps talk right now about what bargaining over what we have been all in together and not what we are all in together. So as the focus was actually of my data and the information was from the 5th of June 2017, when the blockade just occurred, and the neighboring countries closed their borders and airspace until around like the end of 2020, when Abdullah bin Nasser Al Thani, the Prime Minister of Qatar, attended the Saudi summit on regional security in Mecca, and this was actually, for scholars, this was like a kind of de-escalation of the situation. Now, a good way actually to start this presentation is by asking a main question. Actually, this is the main question why we are discussing right now, is why citizenship? I mean, the citizenship, which it means actually particularly, I mean, in the context of Qatar, and perhaps also in the official narrative, it means like a kind of loyalty of the people to the nation. I mean, this is in contradiction to any other definition that you can see in the global society. The citizenship, like being invested and reinvested, being used and reused, is a historical, like well-known practice among GCC countries, but also generally during the time of crisis, or the time of turbulent time, and we have seen that citizenship, like stripping, become a kind of strategic tool to manage the pressure and also to manage the attempts to any kind of political change in the region. Citizenship in that sense is an instant and strategic tool used by the state to assure the loyalty of the individuals and the durability of the system. It is used for both for marginalization, but also for discrimination against the potential threats to the system on one hand, but also an inclusive and a way to include a specific group or specific individuals and promote them for the same purpose. So this is one reason. The other question that I would like to ask is why the 2017 Qatar Gulf crisis. I choose this term because it's a Qatar crisis in the main sense that it is also a Gulf crisis. So the Qatar crisis, or the Gulf crisis, is critical, exceptional, but also to some extent clear case in the way we can use to further like highlight and understand significant mutation and dynamics of citizenship and politics of inclusion during the time of crisis. However, the roots of such crisis go back actually to an early tracks that Qatar chose in terms of foreign policy and building in terms of building like a strong and significant relation with strong players in the Middle East, like the US, of course. And Qatar also has widely worked on supporting some emerging power in the Arab world, particularly during the so-called the Arab Spring, and positioned itself as a soft power, as a country like of having that soft power, particularly through investing in Al Jazeera, a well-known and significant impact state-owned media network, but also organizing the FIFA World Cup and other major sporting events. The other, and this is, I swear this is the last question. Why Qatar? I mean, why would I like choose Qatar as a case study? I think that the early track that Qatar chose in terms of foreign policy, building like that kind of strong relation is important in terms of that. It can be seen also in the country's strategy during the crisis, which doesn't include only to solve the issue related to the supply chain, to the drop in stock market, and the worries about the ambitious ambitious plan for the upcoming FIFA World Cup, but there was also a kind of strategy related to the belonging in the country, especially that we have seen an ever increasing trend of belonging to the nation, especially among some particular group or part of the society. This was like a sort of bottom-up discussion we perhaps see for the first time in the country, and it is particularly important for a country like a rentier state like Qatar, where we know that the state in a rentier system is a superior apparatus, like determines almost everything, like determines even like the principles of citizenship, the principles of belonging to the nation, legally, politically, but also economically. Also, the Qatari vision for the region is different than Saudi or the United Arab Emirates vision, which makes its reaction a bit particular and different. The other reason, and this is going to be the last, is that citizenship in Qatar is also a critical part of state building and state society building, and is ideologically and politically used to reinforce state legitimacy through excluding and including other groups. So let me start by a sort of overview about the whole matter with citizenship in Qatar. Actually, since the GCC founding in 1981, it has long been a strong interest for global like social economic policies, but it was also a complicated area of political parameter. And perhaps the peak of these things is during the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, as you perhaps know, there was like a lot of case of withdrawing like of citizenship, also a kind of issues related to the how the state dealt with the whole manifestation in the ground. But this, however, represented a kind of mere issues compared to the critical crisis that unfolded in 2017, when Saudi Arabia, Arab Emirates, and Bahrain and Egypt also severed their diplomatic and economic ties with Qatar and imposing a total blockade against the country. And they also announced a kind of list for a kind of urgent demand, including shutdown of the state-owned Al Jazeera, in order to lift this blockade. And for many scholars and experts, it was actually a kind of existential crisis for Qatar, perhaps since its independence. I will move directly to the problematic and hypothesis I put for my research. And actually, the research raised the question of citizenship and belongingness at the heart of this transformation during the crisis. I pay close attention to certain demonstration of citizenship and belongingness on both the political and personal level in Qatar state and society. I contend that the turbulent political climate brought by the 2017 crisis resulted in a less restrictive environment around citizenship, which can be seen in public dialogue and media drawing attention to the situation of long-time residents, but also in the official narrative. I draw open like a general assumption that citizenship also is a key domain in which we can rely to understand the social and political transformation. Can think of when tackling this issue, and it is all related to the problematic I tried to raise. It's first the combination of citizenship and belongingness. I mean, for me, it wasn't really possible to rely only on the idea of citizenship to study the case of Qatar. it was imperative also to make this combination of citizenship and belongingness in the present study. And I think actually that citizenship alone is not sufficient to make sense and understand issues in this unique context. Scholars have already actually identified the fact that concept of citizenship and political belonging and participation as defined and also practiced by liberal democracies is problematic when it comes to the monarchy of the Gulf GCC countries, but also other Arab and Muslim countries. The reductionist approach, saying that there is no real citizenship, there is no perhaps no political engagement, there is no even politics in this part of the world, reveals what kind of ethnocentric and Western-oriented conception about this society. Such approach have long been criticized actually in European and American, but also Arabian academia, particularly in the post-colonial studies. George Ballandier, for instance, in his critical anthropology, has emphasized the dynamicity of what Claude Lévi-Strauss often called societies, les sociétés froides. For Ballandier, social mutation, social transformation, the order and disorder occur permanently and in a different form within the context of this society in their what he calls like a colonial status. So this is not a static like societies where there is no like modern ideas about citizenship or so it is only actually through opening politics into sociology and ethnography and perhaps also history that one could construct an internal and profound understanding based on what Ballandier referred to as a dynamic sociology for modernity. And actually scholarship on citizenship has indicated that a long residence period gives a rationale for even more demand of inclusion among those who are living in a country. In Qatar, our case study, citizenship as a legal status is restricted to a minority of people, whereas generation of people has been living in the country for decades. And they are likely to develop a sense of belonging in the absence of any legal framework to acknowledge their citizenship right. So it is imperative not to consider citizenship as a social and economic and to some extent political engagement and privilege supported only by a legal status that determines who is citizen and who is not. It is important also to consider that sense of belonging, what we often refer to as a status of belonging, as it is a basic need, and it can be interpreted in a different manner, different ways. And what I have mentioned actually for the Gulf crisis is that there was actually no understanding or no emphasis of the idea of citizenship and belonging during that crisis. And actually this is like we have seen in the avalanche literature, in the avalanche scholarship, there was only like a kind of perspective related to politics, related to the economic impact of the crisis, but had nothing to do with it. And for also another idea that I want to stress in this regard is that in the scholarly literature, the subject of citizenship is rarely regarded as an important component of the sustainability of the regime. Whereas in GCC countries, this is something that we cannot really talk about stability of the regime without talking about the idea of citizenship. So the case is quite unique here for a rentier state. Because the citizenship means also loyalty to the state. It is acquired through the very process of distribution and redistribution of a large amount wealth and benefit. Also, in the case of the Arab Emirate, we have seen that there is a kind of citizenry, like a building of a citizen that he is like a pro-market, pro-globalization, and pro-business. This type of citizen is a kind of is different than any kind, perhaps, of citizen that we can see across the world. So, and this was actually the main subject of the study by Calvert Jones, entitled Bedouin from Bedouin into bourgeois, if I am remembering. Also, the existing financial benefit and the privilege of the Qatari citizen, as well as presence of a dominant non-national population, have led to an ever more restrictive legal environment around access to citizenship. This reason alone, however, is not enough to explain the sense of fear existing among many GCC citizens when we talk about this subject. Actually, the state invests in a manner or another in this issue to trade the regime stability for the benefit. There are also other issues related to the same idea as for the ruler of Qatar to secure their established border historically. They considered a total separation of population along with the new national territories. And in this regard, I would like to share with you this quote from Zahra Babbar. Being a citizen has political meaning to the people who reside in the country, to those who have access to categories of residency, to those who are included from these categories of residency altogether, and to those who design and police it. So it appears that only when shifting the approach from the institution of citizenship or citizenship as an institution to a performative act of citizenship, which is practiced in the ground, that we can understand like this idea in the GCC context. Also, it is impossible to understand the human conduct while ignoring its intention, and it is impossible to understand human intention while ignoring setting in which they make sense. I mean, having like a citizenship of a country is nothing compared to someone who belongs to a country, but he doesn't have that proof, that passport perhaps, to prove his belonging to the country. I would like also to move to some manifestation of this new emerging citizenship and belonging in Qatar, and I relied mainly on some speech of the Emir of Qatar, Hamad, and especially the one of this speech that was the first to be addressed to the nation, almost like one month after the blockade, and he stressed actually the idea of the unity of the nation, the unity of those who belong to the nation, and we have seen also that he didn't make any kind of distinguishment between or difference between citizens and those who are living in the country. Like the Emir proceed in praising and what he calls spirit of solidarity, the harmony, but also the defiance that prevailed and frustrated the hope of those who banked on the opposite side because of their ignorance of the nature of our society and our people. And here it is like clear how it was important in this new sitting to stress the idea of belonging to the nation, and using actually the term of society in this speech and the other speech to follow refer potentially to those who live in the country. I mean, while when he used the word of our people, he referred to the Qatari nationals. A very significant word such as homeland and home was repeated many times, I mean, reflecting the integrity of the state for those living in its land. There is a significant clear tendency through the speeches to citizen, which is quite different from any remarks or speech that made just a year before the crisis. It is hardly surprising, actually, as residents took the lead in defending the country by showing different sort of support for the country, and this actually goes beyond just praising their contribution during this different time. Also, another way to understand this new manifestation of belonging is on Twitter. This and this next slide, as you know, there's a lot of hashtags that I put in this table here, and as you know, the hashtag represent a manner in which people collectively express their collaborative support to a given case. And concerning the blockade of Qatar, several hashtags appeared extensively during the day following the blockade, expressing demand for citizenship. The hashtag represent an ever-increasing demand spreading from specific Qatari society segments, namely as you can see here, the children of Qatari women married to foreign husband, and also the group of what they call al-bidun, those who are paperless. However, other active group living in Qatar for several generations, known as mawalid, those who live their entire life in Qatar, appears also to be involved in this hashtag. And despite slight improvement actually in the law of citizenship, which was first issued in 1961, there was a kind of marginal improvement after that period of time. And another manifestation of this belonging is this portrait, the Tamim al-Majd or Tamim the Glorious, become a famous icon of unity and patriotism. The portrait was first designed by a young Qatari artist, and it can be seen almost everywhere in the public sphere, including several public entities, semi-public, but also in the public, in the private sector. And people demonstrate their solidarity with Qatar by installing this portrait, whether in the walls, in their cars. So it was not necessarily from citizens. It was mainly from those who are living in Qatar. Another picture that I would like to show you is
Mcgee, sorry to interrupt, but we're way over time. If you can please wrap up so we can make time for question and answer. Sorry to interrupt.
I will try to conclude. Okay. So this is another widespread portrait that I would like to show you. In terms of legal standpoint, which is important actually to an important perspective to look at Qatar post-blockade, we have seen a slight improvement actually just after the blockade, as the institution of citizenship represent the intersection of identity but also law, and is the constitutionally based on articulation of membership in state. Qatar in 2020 announced that the most migrant workers, the state issued a statement in favor of work living in Qatar, most notably passing two laws that strike at the heart of sponsorship system, which is the kafala. There was also this abolish restriction on migrant workers to change their job. Also the end of abuse exit permit. In addition to perhaps we can elaborate further on that. This is an overview of some relevant indicator which I gathered from the BT indicator in terms of political indicator, but you can see here in terms of the political and social integration, as well as democratic status, that there was a remarkable increase, and it wasn't like the case before. Despite actually Qatar being no exception in distinguishing between those who born in the country and those who are naturalized, Qatar may be special case as a rentier state in the attempt to balance between social and economic need of its citizen while ensuring ensuring the sustainability of the system. And we can see also here the rise of interest in regional politics before and after the blockade. As a final note, the June 2017 crisis marked a shift in GCC countries, and Qatar began what appears to be a new pathway at the international and regional level, but even more importantly, at the domestic level, citizenship and belongingness are at the heart of this pathway. The research state society formation, and I gathered many data related to this illustration and manifestation of citizenship and belonging in the country, and it was also mirrored legally in terms of some change in legal like framework. But what I would like to mention is that Qatar persists in a sort of status of putting its house in order even after the blockade. The country actually tried to cope with significant political and social and demographic challenge while trying to deal with the modern paradigm of citizenship, or the global paradigm of citizenship, which is not easy given the pressure that is caused by NGOs, by other humanitarian entities. And the quest actually for scenarios and future development, not only in the crisis that occurred in 2017, but also the future of citizenship and belonging in Qatar, cannot actually is not a straightforward question. It takes a lot of actually intersection and interdisciplinarity, not only between law and the politics, but also in terms of the methods that we are using, in terms of the field work that we are conducting, in terms also of the tools that we are using. So this is perhaps like an overview about my paper, and I'm hoping that we can elaborate further on the discussion. Thank you so much, and thank you for giving me more time. Thank you.
Thank you. I was a little too generous with time today. Anyway, thank you for such great presentations. And if there are any questions, please send them forward. I'm assuming many questions were probably answered, but please send whatever questions in the chat and in the Q&A, or if you would like to be unmuted and ask, but it would be best if you can just write them in. Okay, there's a hand up from Jacob. Do you have a question?
I do. If there's not a rush of other questions, I might abuse the ability to unmute myself to ask Thomas.
Sure, it's always great when panelists ask each other questions, so please go for it.
Great, thanks. And thanks to everyone on the panel. Thomas, I was interested in thinking about how two of my themes, so particularly kind of state building and nation building, relate to your issue here of stateless Kurds. So how has this issue of statelessness kind of impacted the political project in Rojava, and how has this kind of helped, if at all, strengthen this kind of spirit of kind of a Syrian Kurdish kind of separateness and as a distinct nation. Has that been a kind of product of this relationship of statelessness, or has this developed in in another way perhaps? But yeah, so anything on that would be really interesting. Thanks.
Sure. Should I answer now?
I'll read two questions that are directed to Jacob, and then you can answer each question accordingly in the order that the questions are presented. So there are two questions for Jacob. One of them asks, what steps can be taken realistically to work towards positive peace? And another question asks, how the evolution, no, sorry. What should come first, peace building or nation building? And then I'll read a couple other questions and we'll go in order. So a question on history. How does the evolution of state building of the Qatari relations with other states in the region reflect the presentist positions now? And one more question for Al-Mahdi. Can you speak more about how Al Jazeera helps elucidate a Qatari identity? So maybe you all have time to think about the questions. So we'll start with Thomas.
Okay, sure. So thank you, Jacob, for the question. I think it's a really interesting one and quite a complex one to pull out. I mean, I would start by saying that I feel in the case of the Kurds of Syria, there's actually these two intersections of different concepts of statelessness. So the legal de jure statelessness in the sense of being an individual, what I would refer to as a stateless person according to international law, so somebody who doesn't have citizenship of the state, and then the wider concepts that affects all Kurds in Syria belonging to a stateless nation, so being a stateless people. And these two definitely intersect, and I think there's been a lot of work to try and pull out how the two have connected, and how on an individual level stateless Kurds, be they de jure stateless or not, are navigating these different concepts of statelessness. But I would argue that it's less the legal de jure concept that has impacted the Rojava project on the ground, but more the concept of being a stateless nation, and that is very clearly manifested in these concepts of stateless democracy that have been taken up by the Rojava project, of very much bottom-up grassroots governance structures, and it's part of the Kurdish ideology connected to the PYD and the behind the Rojava project in general. I guess there's a lot more to unpack, but that's off the top of my head.
We'll go next in line based on the questions. Jacob, do you remember the questions?
Yes, I've got them. Thanks, Ruba. So if we start with the question about realistic steps for positive peace, I guess I'll answer that question with a question of my own, which is, well, by whom? And I guess I'll reflect on first what the international community might be able to do, and then what the Iraqi government, might be able to do. I think in terms of the international community, what the international community can do to realistically support positive peace is to work a lot more directly with local Iraqi NGOs, which is to work with communities on the ground, as I mentioned in my presentation, so follow more the model that I think is represented by the US Institute of Peace, who works with local Iraqi peace-building organizations, whether it's organizations like Sanad or whether it's the network of Iraqi facilitators. There is really, really good sponsorship there going on to support positive peace, which is genuinely rooted in a kind of grassroots negotiation and acceptance. So I think that is a very positive role to play. And I think the state should start getting involved more in this type of dialogue. Realistic, I don't know exactly how realistic this might be, but even something as basic as for example, getting greater engagement from the Implementation Follow-up National Reconciliation Committee within these type of dialogues would be something that would be, kind of very useful. So I think the realistic steps tend to be the more kind of locally rooted grassroots steps rather than the kind of big political steps. In terms of what should come first, peace building or nation building? Well, I think that's one of those chicken and egg questions, and I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to provide a suitable answer here, not least kind of being put on the spot. But I think one of the things that I guess I'm trying to figure out in my research is what the relationship is between the two, and I would maybe argue that perhaps thinking of them in a linear way is not the way that we should be thinking about them. So it's not that one comes first and then the next comes. I think, much as, Lamé Hébert was talking about mutually constitutive processes, I think that nation building and peace building, should also really be conceived of as mutually constitutive processes that need to be happening at the same time. And they need to inform each other, because I think that's when you get something closer to, a positive peace. But so I appreciate there are lots of questions, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. Al-Mahdi, there are two questions directed to you. Do you remember them, or do you want me to reread them?
Yeah, I think there is a question from Aziz about Al Jazeera.
There was one from Mustafa and one from Aziz. So Mustafa asked about history, the evolution of state building or the Qatari relations with other states in the region and how they reflect the presentist positions now. And Aziz asked, can you speak more about how Al Jazeera helps elucidate a Qatari identity?
For Aziz, I think Al Jazeera as a state-owned like a network, its main interest is not locally. I mean, it's not on Qatar itself, being like a small country in GCC and in the Arab world, but also in the whole region. The Jazeera network actually mirrored the Qatari vision in terms of the foreign policy, and also the Qatari vision for the regional peace, which is a bit different than the Emirati or Saudi vision. And it was one of the reasons behind the blockade of 2017. The vision of Saudi and in the Emirati, for instance, and perhaps also some countries of the West, is that the only way the region, the GCC region, can boom and excel is only by a sort of central and authoritarian regime holding a sort of iron fist against its people through a very strong sitting, and so they can guaranteed a minimum required minimum of economical and political stability in the region. Al Jazeera, I guess, but also the Qatari foreign policy was a bit different. I mean, and it was also accused from the Saudis and the Emiratis by supporting some groups in Egypt, Al-Ikhwan groups, but also their relation with Iran. And I mean, it's not like actually a straightforward question. I mean, Al Jazeera is only, it's not actually it's not the best source to rely on to understand what's happening locally in Qatar. There are other media that emphasize, for example, for instance, a kind of citizen and construction of a citizenry that is based on the market, a pro-market, a pro-capitalist, a pro-business, business citizens, Qatari citizens. Those are of interest for me. It was of interest for me in this research because it illustrates the kind of citizens that perhaps the state wants to see and want also to showcase. I think this is like can be an answer for your question, Aziz.
Thank you. And there is a question again from Mustafa, one on this question of stateless Kurds. He would appreciate if Thomas, I believe the question is for you, if you can elaborate on how the Turkey factor affects the positioning of Kurds within the Syrian landscape. And does Turkey help maintain the statelessness of Kurds as part of maintaining its state interests?
Okay, sure. So I think it's a question that's got multiple layers to it. So certainly the Turkey factor is quite a complicated one, and we've seen in many ways how Kurds who were not previously stateless have actually ended up as a result of the Turkish intervention, suffering from the same rights violations that those who didn't have Syrian citizenship were suffering from previously. So particularly housing, land and property violations, particularly in the Serikaniye Ras Al Ain area, that individuals who were themselves stateless have are again facing the same challenges. But equally, there's other areas like Afrin that are facing that never experienced de jure statelessness in the legal sense. I think the key difference here is in terms of international law that Turkey is clearly a foreign actor. So the distinction is that whether Turkey is now considered an occupying force, and I think there are ways to consider the demographic change that's happening as contributing to potentially non-functioning citizenship or a continuation of the statelessness that was suffered at the hands of the Syrian government previously, and in general, I guess it's a continuation of this dialectic that we've often seen in Kurdish history between oppression and resistance. So I'll stop there for time.
There's a question that has been asked about the notion of nations, and I might rephrase it to ask everyone, to direct this question to everyone. Since nation is an imagined identity, a socialized identity, an inherited identity, and can sometimes be skin deep. So this person asks, do you think we need to dispense with the concept of a nation and work towards state and peace building politics? So this person asked the question in the context of Kurds in Syria, but maybe I'm going to ask, generally speaking, how do our panelists today feel about this kind of question, and how would you answer it in the context that you study? Anyone who wants to venture first?
Well, I guess I'm happy to start out by saying that I think it's a really interesting notion, but I guess I'm struck by, on the one hand, whether or not, as you know, again, as I referenced in my paper, if we think about Lemay Heber's attitude towards state building and nation building, that these are inseparable. That by building the state, you are kind of building a territorially defined nation. So I guess the question is, even if we wanted to, can we jettison kind of this particular concept? Is this something that even if we say intellectually jettison it, is this still something that people are going to do on the ground? So I guess I'm wondering about the level on which kind of you're suggesting about dispensing with the concept and whether or not that, kind of is actually up to us. But I think, one of the interesting things that is mentioned here in the question context in terms of, division amongst Kurds, I think this is the other, kind of really interesting phenomena that we see, which is that, you have plenty of diversity within, kind of ethnic communities. And that I'm not sure whether or not that speaks to the need to jettison the concept of nation, or whether we need to acknowledge that there are multiple nations and that nations are connected to the state, and that we need to conceive of this notion of the nation perhaps, as something that is not limited, kind of just to an ethnic group, for example, but that also spans, kind of different identity markers. I'll leave my incoherent ramblings at that.
I'll direct one last question to Jacob, and I'll ask everyone else to answer the question about nation and peace building. It would be a nice way to end the panel. So since Jacob was just speaking, how do you see the shapes of potential loyalism between intergroups in Iraq, and how does that reflect on the international community actors on the ground in terms of peace building and state building?
I'll be very quick to leave space for others to reflect on this important question of the nation. But I think, look, what's been really interesting is to see how different political and social movements like the Tishreen movement in Iraq, for example, has, really been pushing this idea of intergroup connection, has been rejecting this idea of kind of sectarian differentiation and sectarian difference. And I think, to my mind, what we're seeing is the development of, a relatively, not entirely novel, but certainly in terms of, the way that the national conversation has been going in the last, say, kind of 20 odd years, a very, very, kind of inspiring and encouraging sense of national identity that is distinctively Iraqi, and that jettisons, kind of sectarian labels. And I think it's worth commenting on the fact that this is something that has happened organically, within Iraq, thanks to Iraqi communities and locals, rather than thanks to the efforts of the international community in the context of peace building and stuff like that, where I think arguably they have been less successful. So I think it says something about where the impetus for this needs to come as well.
Thank you. Mansour, since you haven't spoken much yet, I'll ask you about the notion of nation and peace building. Yes. Can we jettison or dispense of the notion of nation towards peace building? Is peace building actually possible by letting go of the term nation? What do you think in the context of Iran, for example?
Good question. In my opinion, it's about the history of the nation building. As you know, Iran has a long history of living the diversity of nations. As you know about the Mongols in 7th century, the stomach of Iran culture eat them and turn them into the Iranian. As you know, we have foreign in Iran, and I think it's a very important note that we look at nowadays Afghanistan. The Afghanistan state has failed because they don't have any nations. I think history is a focus of the concept we should mention about the nation making, and the good nation making lead to the good state, to the active state to have a great policy. I think history is a main feature I insist on.
Thank you. Thomas and then Mehdi.
Thank you for the question. I guess building on Jacob's answer, I can certainly see where the person who asked the question is coming from within the wider Kurdish context. And of course, there is a huge amount of variation in identity, and that's obviously something that is negotiated and navigated on both the individual and collective levels. I guess what is interesting now in the context of the Kurds in Syria is that the Rojava project actually jettisons the concept of state rather than nation. So there we see a non-statist, or even often an anti-statist ideology, and it's based on this notion of democratic nations that are kind of in connection with each other through a kind of, well, the term is used according to that ideology is democratic confederalism, so that each nation is connecting up within a wider system. So according to that practice, the term nation is very much still clung to, and it's the concept of state that is much more challenged.
Thank you. I know it's such a big question, we can barely answer it in one panel. I think it's a question that we might be considering for the rest of the conference. But we'll end with a comment from a response from Mehdi before we go on break.
Thank you, Ruba. I just like another point based on my field work here in Qatar. What I mentioned in the scholarship is that for Qatar, but also I think some other neighboring countries, to secure their established border, historically speaking, they considered a kind of separation of the population along with the new established territories as a kind of essential element, an important element of building their new emerging statehood. And it was also imperative not only to control the land masses and to decide like the borders and this kind of things, but also to decide who would be permanent, who is like the settled population of the state. And this resulted also in a kind of issues related to the idea Jacob was talking about of peace, is that, okay, you have a sort of peace internally, but when it comes to the interaction with the global society, to meet the humanitarian needs, you have an issues internally, because there is the very restrictive environment around citizenship, but also like the rise of a sort of single narrative around citizenship in the country itself about who is citizen and who is not a citizen, makes it very difficult not only to make any kind of slight change in the rules and in the law, but also even to discuss it in the public. Also, this perhaps prevent to show and to illustrate other aspects of diversity of the society itself, because what you have actually is a kind of single and only narrative about who is the citizen and who is not the citizen. You don't have like that open area, that open sphere, that public sphere to discuss perhaps some people who are marginalized, who are not part of the national narrative, if you want. And I will finish with this.
Thank you all for your answers, and thank you for great presentations. And we did go over time. We do reconvene in 25 minutes for a keynote speech by Simon Mabon, and I look forward to that. And I also look forward to this conversation going on, as I said earlier, continuing throughout the rest of the day and the rest of the conference as well. Thank you once again to all the presenters and to all the people who asked questions.